Welcome to Build, Lead, Thrive, Voices of Androscoggin, a bi-monthly podcast that features in-depth conversations with the people shaping Androscoggin County. Each episode dives into personal stories showcasing the leaders and entrepreneurs behind the region's economic and community vitality. I'm your host, Shanna Cox, President and CEO of the LA Metro Chamber. Now, I am joined today by local talent, longtime friend, and our producer, Mr. Mark Turcotte.
Hello.
Hello and welcome.
Thank you.
I love that you're here. Together, we explore how incredible people, the voices of Androscoggin, build, lead, and thrive while contributing to a better quality of life for all. I'm super excited about today's guest. So we have with us Tricia Grant. She's the Executive Director of Just Love Worldwide and equally important, a state legislative expert advisor for the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. She is an incredible and strong advocate for survivors and youth vulnerable to exploitation and a leader in the anti-trafficking movement, which is how I got to know Tricia, but in many stages of her career and her journey. So I'm really excited that Tricia is here with us today. We're going to start with a little ditty, a little segment, getting to know you.
No singing. We used to sing this, Tricia.
It was epic.
Getting to know you.
Getting to know all.
But then we were flooded with complaints.
That's how we knew people were listening. So good. Anyway, so getting to know you.
Yes.
The straightforward edition.
Yes. Getting to know you is where we ask our guests fun, personality-revealing questions to help you learn about and connect with our guests on a personal level. Before we get into the deeper questions, this is like the appetizer before the main course.
I love that part. Little nibbles. Dumplings,
Little
if you will.
nibbles.
Depends on what you like. Could be jalapeno poppers. We'll find out how spicy it is. Tricia, you ready for a couple fun questions?
I am ready.
What is a book, podcast, show, or movie that has inspired you recently?
Ooh. I'm a major podcaster. I love true crime. I love Derek Levasseur and Stephanie Harlow. They happen to be my favorites. They do episodes called Crime Weekly, and it just keeps me up to date on all this stuff. I also love Vinnie Politan, so I watch all of his stuff on,
All those places.
All the places, yes. So those inspire me to open my mind and learn more, and I hear information within those that are applicable to the work that I do. So it keeps it interesting and inspires me to learn more and grow more.
All right, follow-up question. If you're a podcast listener, where do you listen to your podcasts? Car, dishes, what are we talking here?
Oh, everywhere. I listen to it when I'm showering, when I'm doing dishes, when I'm in my car, when I'm just sitting doing work. It's background noise sometimes.
This episode's going to come up at home when my partner tells me, see, everybody else listens to podcasts in the shower too, Shanna.
Oh, I do.
Did not know that was a thing. Sometimes I'm like, who are you in there with? So.
It gives me a good time frame of I'll plug it in and how long I want, and I want to be done showering and getting ready. If I have an hour, I'm like, all right, by the time this is done, I have to be done and move on.
How do you like to unwind after a busy day? And many of your days are busy, Tricia.
They are. Unwinding for me is not the healthiest choices right now, so I'll be just truthful.
Yeah.
And I dive into shows that I like, and those are very random, anywhere from Sex and the City to true crime shows to all kinds of different
I love
things.
guilty pleasure escapism. I have to say that is also one of my, if I have a very short window to leave work mode in my brain and somehow get to you're going to be able to go to sleep soon and you've got an hour from the time you get home to I've got to get to bed. It is a show. It's a complete escapism, not aligned with I can't watch a documentary. I don't need something thought-provoking. I need something just guilty pleasure fluff that I fall into. What is your favorite way to spend time in Androscoggin? So we're going to touch on this, but you work all over the state. But before we got on, Tricia was telling us about her recent excursion to Aroostook. But I know you're familiar with this neck of the woods. You spent some time here. So what's your favorite way to spend time in Androscoggin County?
I love driving, so I drive around a lot and I go to water spots. So I have some very specific spots that I drive to if I just want to sit by the water, because it is a place that definitely soothes me and just calms me down and centers me. So I drive to water. I also go to places where there are horses, and there are a few places here. There was one place in Auburn that I used to go to often, but they're no longer housing horses. So I really love horses. So anywhere there's horses or water, that's where I'll be.
What's your favorite water spot? I'm terrified of horses. I'm just going to out myself. Horses terrify me, so my follow-up question is definitely about the water.
I love horses.
I can see why. I just am terrified of them.
Yes, I like Riverside. I actually drive down Riverside a lot because there's a lot of places to pull off and stop and just watch the water flow, and just sometimes when it's warm outside you can get out and just sit by the water, and sometimes you can just sit in your car and observe the water.
Yeah.
So
That is one of my favorite drives too.
I like the windy roads too.
Yeah. Throw in some farmland that doesn't have horses on it. I'll take a cow.
You don't even observing horses?
Yeah, I've thrown at a good distance. Like at a good distance. They're big.
They're huge.
I'm not a
Very
walk up to
powerful.
the fence and reach over ever kind of gal. No. Yeah, I can see they're beautiful. Flowy hair, shiny coat, majestic beast. I get it. I can see why other people love them. They're big. I almost got thrown from a horse once. Like, it's a real founded fear and not a made up one like my escalator. Fear. It's fine. So this might be something that you've already touched on, but what is your go-to productivity hack when you're feeling overwhelmed?
Doing things in short periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
So focusing on okay, this is a task I know I can get done and completed within this amount of time, and I get that thing done.
Yeah.
And then usually inspires me to keep going and keep moving on to the next task. That's usually the hack that I use, and sometimes it's to just get up and move, stretch, move your body, make sure I'm hydrated, make sure I'm not hungry, making sure I'm doing a self-care check.
People skip that. And I have watched people power through 6 hours of computer work and hours worth of meetings, and they haven't done just the very basics of make their blood flow and keep some water and some food going through their body. And it is insane how just basic it is to meet that need, and how fundamentally important it is to being productive and guilty, right? There are so many times that I'm my brain physically hurts. Have I fed my brain today? Have I put any protein in my body? It's not a small thing. Thanks for lifting that up, because I do think that one gets limited. A lot of people just forget.
Yeah, self-care matters, and just basic needs. You have to make sure those are taken care of to function properly.
No, and it does get skipped a lot. And I think people sometimes think that self-care is booking a massage or getting a pedicure, and lovely, big fan of both, please don't get me wrong, but really just some basic, are you taking care of yourself? Doesn't have to be the grand spa day. I'm not complaining about a grand spa day, but just stay hydrated. Just stay hydrated, folks.
You ask any of my friends and they'll tell you my number one thing that I ask them, have you had water?
Yeah.
And when they're in the crisis, have you had water?
Yeah.
Take a sip of water. Just take a sip of water.
Yeah.
It allows you to breathe. It allows you to feel the water flowing through you, and it works.
It really does.
Doesn't fix everything, but it works.
No. Well, it gives you the space and center to be able to think about how to fix the things. And you can't fix a darn thing if you haven't been able to start. That's an important piece. All right, so as we dig into our main course, bring on the meat and potatoes, the soybeans and broccoli of tonight's entree. We want to cover a little bit more about your background and work, in part because they're inextricably linked, right? And I think that's something that I really love and respect about you and the work that you do. So, Tricia is a survivor of domestic minor sex trafficking who now educates and mentors youth and adults in large group and one-on-one settings about the realities of human trafficking and exploitation. As a survivor leader, Tricia consults with organizations all over the country. Thanks for staying in Maine. We appreciate that. She works with first-time sex buyers, facilitating groups of offenders as a diversionary program in the state of Maine. Having been trafficked in Maine and throughout New England when she was only 15 and living on her own with her little boy, Tricia has been able to connect deeply with both at-risk youth and encourage victims of trafficking and exploitation and sexual trauma as they move forward in their healing process. So Tricia has worked with governors and attorneys generals to educate groups of healthcare providers, educators, law enforcement, and business professionals, which is some of our most recent connections. But I've been engaged in your work as you have started just in community education here in the greater Lewiston, Auburn area. You share your story with the hope that it will help others understand that trafficking can happen to anyone, anywhere, and prevent victims from waiting 16 years to talk about it, as she did. Thank you. It is a lovely bio, and I think starts to shed a light on like why this work that you do is so important, but also why you're so good at it. I think it is very easy to overlook. Oftentimes in some of the spaces where I do kind of collaborative social impact-based work, we talk about the value of having people with direct lived experience contribute to the thinking, the strategies, the leadership, the change piece. And I think this is just a really good example of how that can kind of transform work that is happening when someone can speak to and maybe even dispel some of the assumptions that people make. I just think it's so vital. I could never tell your story better than you can, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. So you've turned an incredibly difficult personal experience into a mission to help others. Can you share maybe a pivotal moment when you realized that your voice and story could create change? Like, at what point did you find that in your journey?
As my bio stated, I'd been waiting for 16 years to be able to even identify that there was a name for what was done to me, and I didn't even know that there was.
Yeah.
So I didn't know what to call it, even if I did start talking about it. And then, secondly, I didn't realize it wasn't my fault, because with this issue comes a lot of shame, blame, guilt. Mm-hmm. You carry a lot of that, and it makes it harder to talk about. So I had waited 16 years to even know there was a name for what happened to me, and it wasn't my fault. Once I realized that, my life fell apart, actually.
Yeah.
Like, I'd been silent for so long that I couldn't bear all of that, like, coming right in front of my face again, everything I'd been trying to hide. So I spent 18 months really trying to pull my life back together. And like in that time, I got divorced. I lost my teaching job that I had for 12 years because I just couldn't keep myself productive and composed and showing up for work. I just couldn't do the basic things. So I lost my job. And I had 3 kids that I was caring for, one of them who was very ill and has autism. So I was really just holding a lot of weight and not knowing that there were people that could help, or not knowing how to talk about it, not knowing the words to use.
Yeah.
So 18 months it took me to pull my life back together again. But
I would just say that's a great timeline. Wow, how to do it so quickly. That's a hard spot to be in, and I've been in similar spots, and I've been on the road with folks in similar spots, and it is such a hard place to come out of, and it doesn't happen quickly.
It doesn't.
No.
And it takes time to even have that self-awareness that, wow, like this is why this is happening, but also have grace and kindness for yourself that I'm not lazy. I'm not just in a mental crisis that has no end.
Yeah.
You know, you think those things through and you finally get to a place where you're like, okay, what can I control in this moment? What can I do to regain that foundation that I need to sustain life and my children's lives? Like, what do I need to do? So over that time, I was doing those things while caring for my children and trying to figure out all these things that I was uncovering. So what are these things? What is trafficking? What is exploitation? What happened to me? What was done to me?
You were learning the language of it.
I was, and I was learning about this issue. Like, for the first time, it felt like I was not living through it, but learning about it.
Can you remember the moment that, or the language that helped, that was unfortunately both the start of what sounds like 18 months of pretty dark times, but was also really the start of this stage of your life and all of the things you've been able to accomplish in it. Now that you have language, now that you own your story and that you're kind of in that spot, how did you get introduced to that language? Like, what was that moment, and how could we maybe help someone else have that moment too?
Yeah, it's fascinating how each of our stories are so different, but I love my story of how this happened. I'd been going to church for 8 years and never heard the terms sex trafficking, exploitation, prostitution talked about in a way that wasn't just what's in the Bible.
Yeah.
You know, I hadn't heard any of that language, anything talked about, any information provided within a community that was supporting me in some ways, but just not that way. So our youth group at that church went to an event raising funds for another nonprofit called Love 146. And at that event, I was in a beautiful ball gown, dressed up, in charge of like caring for other youth. And the founder said, I'm going to talk to you guys about trafficking, but I'm not going to talk about it the way that I usually do. I'm going to talk about trafficking locally. And I was like, well, what is that?
Yeah.
What is local trafficking? And I had heard of trafficking, but in my mind, as somebody who was a victim of this crime, I thought it was something that happened to little girls in other countries.
Yeah.
That was my understanding of what trafficking was.
Mine too, for such a long time in my life. It's the only narrative that is talked about. In particular, I mean, maybe not so much anymore, but largely in public forums, trafficking was getting humans, often children, from other places into other countries. Period.
Yes. Yeah, or it was things you see in the movies, like people are kidnapped and then brought to other countries.
Yeah.
Like that was my understanding of what trafficking even was. And prostitution for me was just something people chose to do on the street and they made money doing it.
Yeah.
And it was a quid pro quo, so no big deal.
Yeah.
That was my understanding.
Yeah, everybody in those situations are consenting and it's fine, and why do we need to talk about it? That is often the narrative around prostitution.
Yes. So what happened at this event was the founder, Rob Morris, brought up local trafficking and he explained what it was. And I probably turned white as a sheet when he was talking about it, just having all of that brought right to the front of my brain of all these things I was trying to hide for so many years. And then I was like, wow, there's a name for this, and it's called trafficking. And it wasn't my fault.
Yeah.
But what do you do
That was
with
part of the
that?
message, right, that day, I hope?
Yes.
Because could you imagine not getting those two messages at the same time? Right, like here's language for it, but it's still a blame game piece. So I'm glad that they were paired together for you that day.
Yeah. So it was like in that moment, I was just still very paralyzed of, I don't know what to do with this information.
Yeah.
Clearly it's too dark to talk about at church because we're not talking about it and nobody wants to hear it.
Yeah.
It's like when you ask somebody how their day is and they've just had an awful day, but
Fine.
I'm fine.
Good.
I'm good.
I'm good.
You know, and that's what it felt like for me in
Yeah.
those moments of, I've been going to church for 8 years and never hearing about this. So
Yeah.
clearly people don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Because it's too dark. It's too hard to talk about. There's too much confusion around it.
It's too hurtful. It hurts to talk about some of these topics, right?
Yeah, or it's too heavy, or I can't do anything about that, or that doesn't happen to anybody I know, so it's not a me issue. You know, so there's all of those thoughts going through my head, and also, like, I couldn't talk about it at church. I didn't have a family structure that had people in it that I could go to with this information and say, this is, I just learned this, and I don't know what to do now. So I didn't have that. My work community, they just didn't feel appropriate to like talk about it at work. And also if I brought it to law enforcement, because I knew what had been done to me at that point was a crime.
Yeah.
But there were people in law enforcement who bought me as a 15-year-old. So I knew that not all law enforcement were bad, but I didn't know who the good ones were.
Yeah.
So I didn't know what to do. So I just sat for 18 years and waited until I started to learn myself. And then I went to another conference where another survivor was sharing her story. And I at that moment, I knew I had to say something at some point because the people who had trafficked me were still advertising in the local newspaper for exotic dancers. So I knew that this was still happening to other people. But what do I do with that? And I felt like going to law enforcement was probably the best bet, but who do I talk to?
Yeah.
So at this event, there were law enforcement who were standing up. Our police chief for Auburn at that time had stood up on that stage.
Phil Crowell?
It was Phil Crowell, and I love that man. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to name drop.
He's a previous, I can't remember what episode he was, maybe 5 or 6, but no, I love Phil. Phil is one of the people who gave me language to describe this to outside of just basic like prostitution and sex work, and his framework for being able to speak about even in your bio, the language that I love that you offered. I'm going to read it again because I just think it's really, really powerful, the way that you frame, you and many others, I'm sure you're not the only one using this language, but sex buying And the fact that somebody who is actively buying sex, that they themselves might need the support and the education, like the financial transaction piece that usually gets focused on, and it's a victimless crime and like all of that language. Phil was one of the first people to not just give me language to understand it and describe it, but to also really flip the paradigm of what I thought about it as. And at that point in my life, when Phil was kind of bringing that into education and community spaces, I owned a house on the corner of two streets that's maybe one of the more active corners in our communities, and really was trying to, I had 3 boys that I was a single mom raising, and like trying to find ways to describe without judgment, and that embrace some empathy, but also recognize like safety, because it's not just that these almost always women were standing here and that it was pretty clear what they were engaged in, but it was the buyers that I was scared of, right? Who were pulling up next to my house and my kids. And so, yeah, big love to Phil Crowell once again. Go on, sorry, but yes, we love Phil.
I do, and he just has such a special place in my heart. And that day, I saw another man stand up on the stage from Homeland Security, and I was like, okay, I feel like I could talk to one of those 2 people and they would hear me. And a reoccurring thought in my head was always, well, does it even matter anymore? It was 16, at that point, it was 17 and a half years later, like, does it even matter anymore?
Yeah.
And the answer was always yes, because
it wasn't done.
This is probably still happening to other people. And I didn't know the gravity of this issue. I didn't realize the amount of people here in our own community that have experienced trafficking and exploitation. I didn't have any of that information yet. I just knew the people who trafficked me were likely still trafficking other people.
Yeah.
That's all I knew. And that day, I told the person from Homeland Security in the hallway, I said, hey, this happened to me when I was 15. I don't know if it matters anymore, but it did. And the people who trafficked me are still advertising in the local newspaper. And he said, yes, it does matter. And they opened my case that day.
Yeah.
Like that day, Phil Crowell and this person from Homeland Security, who is now a very good friend of mine,
got into it.
Heard my story for the first time, and I don't remember anything that I said. I don't.
Yeah.
My visual of how that played out was that I was sitting in the corner of the Auburn Police Department with chairs all around me, and these 2 men that I didn't know at that time. One of them, Phil Crowell, who is
that man fills a doorway. He's so huge. I always forget how tall he is until I like walk up to his belly button. Essentially, he's so tall. Yeah.
Yes. So they heard my story that day, and I mean, it's just been one step after the next step after the next step since then. And it took about a year and a half for them to do the investigation and investigate the people who had trafficked me. And it has shifted hands. It had shifted hands at that point to other people who own it. And as far as we know, they have not uncovered any trafficking situations within the new people who are running the organization, but they are still being watched and people are paying attention. And I'm trying to create new laws around better structures of people who have legal organizations like strip clubs and exotic dancing businesses, or create more laws around who's watching over them to make sure that they're not trafficking anybody, let alone a 15-year-old.
Yeah. So you know what stands out about your story and really deeply resonates with me? I went through a childhood traumatic experience and sat with it quietly like you for many, many years. And ultimately the thing that made me break my silence and really start in earnest my own healing journey, it was never for myself. I think for so many survivors that it's really challenging to be like, I'm a good enough reason. Like part of the trauma that we've survived leads us to believe we're not. Like we have less worth, and like that is the narrative that's created by the power structure that it creates the trauma more often than not. And it wasn't until I recognized that my silence was creating risk for other people that I finally said something. And I mentioned that, A, because that really does deeply resonate with me, and B, it is unfortunate and never ceases to amaze me the way in which we will do for others that which we won't do for ourselves, right? We are kinder to our best friend who is saying like, oh, I'm stupid, or we don't speak that way about yourself, but we would never stop ourselves from speaking that way about ourselves, right? And it's just such a repeated pattern that I think is very real, and I lift it up and what you're sharing about it, because for anyone who is listening, if you are not enough of a reason, and trust us, you are, there is another additional great reason, which is that you could stop the harm happening from someone else. And that was the only thing that gave me, I don't even know if it was courage. Like, I think it was out of fear that I acted, right? The fear that it would happen to someone else that made me speak up.
It's that's so common amongst all of us.
Yeah.
Like, we'll all give the shirt off our back to help and protect and encourage and uplift other people. But when it comes to ourselves, when we've experienced trauma, and also just some people, by the nature of our community and social media and how we view people now, it's sometimes a lot harder to just look at ourselves and say, you're worth it.
Yeah.
Like, you are worth it alone for no reason other than you're a human being and you're worth it.
Yeah. That's a message people could hear more often, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Many people still think of human trafficking as something that happens elsewhere, not in their own communities. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about trafficking in Maine and beyond that you might be able to share? Let's bust some myths.
Yeah, I think some of the biggest misconceptions is that maybe it only happens in the larger areas like Lewiston or Auburn or Portland or Bangor or, the larger communities, but that's so not true. When I was trafficked all over Maine in the most quiet neighborhoods, very developed, wealthy neighborhoods, not just poor communities. I was brought everywhere. Yeah. So that's one myth for sure. Another myth is that, it doesn't happen very often. It does. The last study that was done in 2015, which is a very outdated study, and we need to do a new study, but those numbers indicate that there were between 200 and 300 cases every year of trafficking. And one is too many. But 200 to 300 cases, that's not acceptable.
Yeah, particularly in a populated state that has such low population as
yes,
Maine.
and those are only the identified cases, though. Those are not the people that I might come in contact with.
So that would have been not your case for 16 years.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's that misconception. Another misconception is that people who buy sex are, poor people or immigrants or people who are coming from out of our country. That's not the reality at all. I run a diversion program where we've had 52 participants, and the large majority of them are middle-aged white men who own businesses. Yeah. Another misconception, people only buy sex at night. That's so not true. Yeah. The majority of people who get busted buying sex are on their lunch breaks.
Wild.
They're buying sex.
I had a friend who worked at a local package store, and the amount of nips, the little tiny alcohol bottles that are sold on the lunch break.
Yep.
I'm doing lunch differently. I'm just doing lunch differently than apparently some people, but it had never even crossed my mind, right? Like, my guilty pleasure at lunch is the drive-through, which I let myself do once every couple of weeks. And so, that does not surprise me, but it is not the first thing you think of.
Yeah. No,
nowhere near it.
And people, probably one of the other misconceptions is that it only happens to people in poverty, people with low economic status. Like, that's not true at all. One of my very good friends, Tricia Flores, came from a very wealthy family. She was 15 also, and she was trafficked. It happens to so many people. Another misconception is that it's older people or people who are of consenting age. And the average age of entry into trafficking is between the ages of 13 and 14. Wow. That's the average age of entry into trafficking. And even now, when I was being trafficked, there was no internet.
Yeah, great point.
Kids are being targeted so hard right now because there are no protections for our children, especially if they don't have parents looking over their engagement on social media. Yeah. Especially there. And more often than not, parents just don't know what they're looking for and know what to look for.
Well, and I as a parent and someone who was younger when my own Survivor story was started, you just don't think that's ever going to happen to your kid.
Yeah.
Outside of the fear of the white van that pulls up at the mall, right? Like that kind of mental narrative that you have, so shy of that. Like, it's not going to happen in your home. It's not going to happen in your neighborhood. You don't think of that. And I've had to manage, 4 young men through their social media journeys, and there's this tension point over respecting their space and respecting their privacy, but also monitoring use and what their use is and what their contact is. I would be curious, I guess this is more of a question than anything, but I got really good at the apps and the phone, completely spaced the access that outsiders have to my kids on games, gaming systems. You can just be in a chat room, or I don't know, listen, I don't play games a lot, but you're on the box or the station, and you've got your headset on, and then you're just playing a game with somebody, getting to know them and all of their passwords and secrets, and that was an area that I hadn't even thought to monitor, right?
Yeah, and we have to give ourselves a break as parents. We can't be the end all be all. Yeah. We just can't. So we're not in a world anymore where we have to teach our children what to do if something happens. It's when something happens. Because something is going to happen.
Yeah.
Somebody is going to try to engage them in a conversation that they don't want to be engaged in, that's inappropriate, that doesn't feel right to them. What skills do they have to combat that?
Yeah.
And if something does go too far, who are they going to go to? Who do they have for safe people in their circles to go to when something happens?
Is that the heart of the work that you do with youth?
It is. Also education. I run curriculum that Love 146 created, actually, called Not a Number. So I run that curriculum in middle schools, high schools, youth groups. I ran it at Long Creek. I've ran it at group homes. So that's part of it too. But in doing that education, of course, because we're sharing some hard things, we get a lot of disclosures because of that. And a lot of youth feel safe coming to me.
You're the Phil Crowell in their room.
Yes. Oh, that made my heart happy.
Yeah, but that is, right? You're doing that now for others the way they did that for you.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Just being a safe space for people to know, hey, there's nothing you can tell me that's going to shock me. There's nothing you can tell me that's going to make me like you or love you any less.
Yeah.
I am here.
How do you take care of yourself after one of those days? That's hard.
Yeah, those are the hardest days, for sure. Yeah.
How do you take care of yourself?
I think it depends in that moment. Depends on the weather. It depends on my mood. It depends
when you go find a body of water or a windy road and just recenter yourself a little bit.
Yes, and sometimes I'll go through that drive-through and grab some onion rings and dip it in buffalo sauce. If you haven't tried that, it's so delicious.
I do the zesty sauce, but I will try the buffalo.
Try the buffalo.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit weak when it comes to spice, as Mark might attest to. But I've been working up to buffalo for 2 years. I've been in training on my heat tolerance, and I'm doing great. So I'll try the buffalo.
It's not overly spicy. I don't love overly spicy either. So.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't love me is usually the trouble that I have. How can everyday people and business leaders play a role in prevention and support? So, one of the things that I'd love for you to talk about, because I think it's any business, but there are definitely specific industries where either you have access to somebody who's being trafficked that's unusual and might give you kind of an intervention point, or your industry is in a place where you are more likely to engage with people who are being trafficked. And so, for those of us out here in the world trying to make tomorrow just a little bit better for somebody, what are things that we could know or look for or do?
Yeah, I definitely always say start with examining yourself, examining your own understanding of what trafficking, exploitation, prostitution actually is. Because we all have biases, we all have judgments.
Yeah.
We all look at people and are like, I wonder, do they really have a choice? Do they really want to be there? Are they just lazy? All of those things you have to examine in yourself of what are the judgments you're passing on that person that you're looking at.
Yeah.
If somebody isn't showing up to work, like my situation when I was teaching, if somebody isn't showing up to work and lying when they don't normally behave in that way because they can't cope with working, so they're making up excuses, they're lying, what's really going on? Step aside the employer role for a moment and look at that person like a human and say, what is going on with this person? I've known this person for 12 years and this is not how they typically act or behave. and examine that piece of it. So there's looking at people in
Before you go on from that, I like to think of all of my team as people first, and so that's always my approach. But for any employer, yes, we do wear two hats. So you sit down with somebody, hey, what's going on? I'm concerned. This is an unusual pattern for you, and they share anything with you. What's a resource an employer could use or call, or what's the advice that, like, first of all, you're sitting across from someone, you're in a very vulnerable human moment, you're giving the space for them to share, you're listening and brought it up out of concern. But boy, I can tell you, most of us would be like, good Lord, what do I do now? And so what would we do now as an employer?
Yeah, I think first you need to ask that person what they want to do. Ask them where they want this information to
go. Go ahead and say that again, because that's really good advice and probably not our instinct. Most of us are solvers, right? Like we would jump in and be like, oh, let's do X, Y, Z. But that's, so say it again, Tricia, for those in the back.
Ask that person that you're speaking with what they want to do, because they might need to just take a minute.
Yeah.
And they might say, I need to just digest what I just told you first before I can do anything
every
else.
intuition in my bones. So thank you, because that's really wise advice.
Yeah, and it is. And you have to release yourself of the outcome of that.
Yeah.
Because not every survivor wants or is ready for it. I don't want to say that. I want to correct that and say not every survivor is ready for that. We all want it.
Yeah.
We all want what was done to us to be known and to have people that want justice for us. We all want that, but we're not always ready for that.
Yeah.
So examine the level of readiness. Let them know first they're safe. Like, you're in a safe space here. I care about you as a human before anything else. Yes, I have a business to run here, and I have to tweak things on my end to make that work differently if for the moment you're not able to be here in that role. And let them know if you have capacity to do that. But obviously, you do run a business, so you do have to have your business hat on and your humanity hat on.
Yeah.
If you have the capacity to offer them that safety and that space to just breathe, to just simply breathe. And
give them
sit.
water.
Yes, give them water. Yes, give them water.
Yeah.
And just let them know they're safe. If they know that they're safe with you, even from the beginning of anybody ever making a disclosure to you, if you let your employers know this is always a safe space for you to go, if anything is happening personally for you in your life that you just need help with, or you need a cushion, if you need to be able to take a breather, we want to know that. If they know that, then they're going to do that before they're going to start telling the lies, before they're going to start making excuses for not coming into work. If they know that.
And just a little plug on that point, a couple of things that I've learned, usually the good way, which is nice, not the hard way all the time, but we work with 750 members in our business community. I think there is a narrative for a whole bunch of reasons, but I think there's a narrative sometimes that, like, employers don't care and they don't wear the humanity hat and it never takes the first seat. It's always the business. We handle so many discrete requests for support for employers who are asking to help. What is the resource I can use to help my employee navigate this? Where can I give them? It is far more common than people suspect. And I just want to put that out there, which is to say, like, if you're an employer in that spot, you are amongst good company if you are creating space to help an employee figure out what might seem on the surface like, that's not my problem. There are so many employers that are doing exactly that and navigating that. And I would say your local chamber might be a good starting point for some of the resources that I would know how to get a hold of Tricia, for example. And I think, people don't often know that. And many employers are just like, I've never dealt with somebody who's naming that they think they might be addicted and need to start a recovery step, or is dealing with sex trafficking, or dealing with domestic violence, or like those are things that when your employee tells you that, you take the minute, but then you do want to do something, or at least be able to have a resource both for you on how to manage that and for the person who just disclosed to you. And so, that's really nice to lift up.
Yeah, and I think letting that employee know just from the hiring point of if things are going on, like I just said before, like, you're safe, we care about you, we can help you through whatever's going on by connecting you to other resources. You're not being the one to, like, be the counselor, be the fixer, help them. You're not the one to do that, but you do have resources and you are going to support them through that journey. It makes all the difference. Because we can't be anybody's end all be all. So it's important to let them know we're here. So I think starting at that point too, but then if that person says, well, what can I do? Then you can say, well, we have options. We can reach out to law enforcement because they're the ones who will be eventually needing to handle the criminal aspects of this. But if you want to first start with an advocate, we have advocacy agencies right here in Lewiston and Auburn, right here in Androscoggin County. We have them all over the state. I do live in Auburn, but I work out of Westbrook, but I work all over the country. So you can always reach out to me. You have Safe Voices you can reach out to. You have sappers.
What are some of the terms that one would Google to find a local advocacy organization to end up in the right spot? Because the names are so distinctly different by community and by region. And so, if you're, or for example, you're at a conference and you're in the bathroom and a woman is able to admit to you that she's being trafficked, for example, and you're not in your own comfortable, familiar community, what are some of the terms that someone could Google to find the right local organization? Or are there national ones, I guess?
Yeah, there is a national hotline number. It's under examination right now, so it's not always... probably scratch that, but
it's fine. Yep, and
scratch out.
And it's just not working right now.
It's not.
That's
really
wild.
Well, there's a lot of controversy around it right now. So this is the number I usually give out. That's the number that's on my business card, but reconsidering that one. So
that's so unfortunate.
It is very unfortunate, but I don't entirely agree with the controversy around it.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of where you stand on what their policies are around what's happening right now. So,
yeah. So if you did Google something, would you just trafficking advocacy or?
Yeah, exactly. You could just throw in some keywords of Chicago trafficking advocacy.
Yeah.
A hotline number. You can, that's where I would start for sure.
Great. Yeah. Locally, if you are in our area, to our dedicated core listeners, it is Sappers, it is Safe Voices. There are some great resources locally, and they do amazing work. But depending on where you might experience it, I wouldn't know where to turn if I was in a different state. Or I'm fortunate to have some great connections across most of Maine. But if I was in Aroostook County, I don't know where I would go. So I would be Googling. In a restroom at a hotel is what I would expect myself to be doing.
Yeah.
And how do I help this woman?
And if you don't get any hits on that, you can put in keywords sexual assault organizations, because most of the sexual assault organizations are going to understand this issue.
Yeah.
Third to that, if you don't get any hits on sexual assault, Google domestic violence. And domestic violence organizations like Safe Voices here in Lewiston, they also manage a lot of anti-trafficking work.
That's helpful to think of, because I think for a very long time I thought of trafficking as very separate from sexual assault, very separate from like gender-based violence or any type of domestic violence. It's not the same, like in the mental picture, which just goes to name the bias and the cultural kind of images and assumptions that we build around it. But it's helpful for you to say that explicitly. I know that now, but I definitely lived most of my life not knowing that.
I did too, and I saw brochures when I was 15 about what do you do when you're raped. You can contact sexual assault organizations. Well, I wasn't just raped once.
Yeah.
It was repetitively, and that just didn't seem to fit the
that
brochures.
Wasn't your story.
It wasn't my story.
Right.
So then I look at domestic violence, and I'm like, well, I'm not in a domestic partnership with this trafficker, which is actually it's not very uncommon, but it is uncommon. More often than not, people who are trafficked are in a domestic type of relationship with the person who's trafficking them.
Yeah.
And there's also familial trafficking, where it's somebody in your own family who's trafficking you. So where does all that fit?
Yeah.
And it's not domestic violence. It's not sexual assault.
Right.
It is trafficking, exploitation, prostitution. But there are so many crossovers, just like with substance use. The majority of people who are trafficked and exploited are also struggling with substance use.
Yeah.
So there's so much crossover that each organization really does need to understand this issue, but that's why you go to organizations like mine when you want to solely focus on that specifically. Because I will help people that have experienced domestic violence and not trafficking, or experienced sexual assault or childhood abuse or all of those other traumas or substance use, but I'm going to refer out to those organizations that focus on that specifically and still be there to support them along that journey.
Well, you all, and that's not a phrase I offer lightly or often, but you all, and by that I mean good, caring people who are helping people come out of trauma, deal with trauma, make sense of trauma that happened a long time ago even. You all network well, share information well, learn from each other well. And so I don't know that I've ever thought of like a wrong door. It is an imperfect system for sure, but you can usually find some connection if you get the... Doesn't mean that won't be a hard journey, but there is a good awareness.
There is. And I've also struggled within Maine to be able to get people to not operate in silos.
Yeah.
Because so much of the work that we do does have crossover, that we really do need to be partnering together more and working more as a community. So that's been my message, my loud message over the last few years of we need to collaborate better, even if we don't agree on all the things.
Yeah.
Because like the new laws that were created, I am wholeheartedly in support of them, but a lot of the people that I work with, a lot of my colleagues were not and are slowly coming on board or are still not on board.
Yeah.
And that's okay. We still need to do the work together.
Yeah.
Even if we don't agree with some of the things that within those organizations we're doing.
One of the things that I really appreciate about your work, Tricia, is you do both direct service and systemic work, and I do not want to undermine that. And I have deep gratitude for people who are in the hard interpersonal work of helping people who are recovering from dealing with, finding, understanding their trauma. But you do incredible policy and systemic work, and I tend to, like, when I think about the best impact from my time of commitment to something, maybe not the most rewarding, right? Because there's something that you can't get from a policy conversation, that having a real conversation with a real human that you are understanding and listening to, like that's irreplaceable. So, but man, the impact, you can impact so many more people when you're looking at policy. You've advised lawmakers and worked with governors and attorneys generals to push for change. What are some of the policies or systemic shifts that you think are most critical in combating human trafficking?
Yeah, I'll first start by saying policy work was something I avoided for many years, and I wanted...
No one makes it look good.
I wanted nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
I'm like, politicians? Ew. Like, no thank you. I don't want anything to do with that. And that was fine in that time because I was really focusing on direct service work and education. And I was okay focusing on those things, and they were deeply impactful and deeply meaningful to me. But then once this conversation about the equality model popped up, I became curious because the first time these bills came through in, I believe, 2021 maybe, I wasn't in support or in opposition of them. I just didn't know enough.
I love that good journeys always start with curiosity.
Yes.
Yeah, get curious, people.
Yeah.
Go find out. Go get curious.
Yeah, if you
and
wanna,
then go from there.
Yeah, if you
it's
want
not a
to know
commitment.
about
Curiosity.
something, just talk to people, engage with people who are doing that kind of work. So I became curious because I didn't like sitting on the fence. I didn't like my reason for needing to sit on the fence.
Yeah.
I'm not somebody who's just going to agree to something because somebody says it's a good idea.
No,
I do not.
I do not believe that you are, ma'am.
No. And it's fine if people like it's fine. Like, there's no judgment there. It's just not who I am as a person. I want to know why I'm committing to something. I want to know why I'm doing this. And I didn't. In part because I didn't understand how our government operated. I had a very rough childhood, so I wasn't really fully present in school to be able to retain all that knowledge about how our governments operate, how laws are created, how you get elected, what elections mean, what people in electoral positions, like what they do. I didn't know any of that stuff.
Or how bills are created. I'm not going to sing Schoolhouse Rock right now, just for people who like to avoid my singing, but it is in my head.
I'll have to go Google
I'm
that
just
later.
a Bill. There's this great song that is like the best way to learn about. It's a good starting point for folks.
I'm going to go look at it.
I will say it's the cutest, most fun policy has ever looked. Is Schoolhouse Rock's version? It's a good. Get curious.
I love it.
Yeah, it's so great. You would love it.
Yeah,
you would love it.
So I had to learn that, and a good friend of mine, Nate Walsh, who is our assistant district attorney in Androscoggin County, he is a saint. Like, he answered so many elementary questions for me that I was just like, I don't have time to go and do Google searches and read 20 books and understand all this. I need to know what I need to know right now. Like, what are the key things that I need to know right now? And he explained things to me and then re-explained things to me and then re-explained things to me again until I understood it. And I am so deeply grateful for that. Our assistant district attorney did that for me. Like, who does that? This man cares about this issue more than a lot of other people I know. So he did that for me because he knew how important this was. I didn't understand how important it was, but he didn't try to just say, it's really important, you should just do it. You should just sign on to it. He never did that. He said, let's backtrack. Let's look back. Let's understand how this bill came to, what you like about it, what you don't like about it. And when the bills came forward again, I was on board with it because I understood it. I understood the impact that creating new policies could have on the survivors that I was working with. People were still getting arrested for prostitution. Women, people being victimized primarily. There are men and boys who also get trafficked. Yeah. But the people that I primarily engage with, as far as sex trafficking goes, were women. So, there was that whole part of understanding, like, what does this even matter anymore? What can you do about it? And simple, like the women that I was working with had charges of prostitution, but not just that, they also had charges around forced criminality, which were crimes that they were forced to commit by their trafficker, by their pimp, and they're the ones who got charges for them. Mm-hmm. Some of those look like theft charges or breaking and entering or drug charges. Mm-hmm. So those are all charges that these women that I was working with day in and day out were fighting against because they can't get employment.
Yeah.
They can't
when this
get
has
housing.
been the means of finding financial income and resources, and then most other avenues of income are closed off to you, it doesn't really provide a good starting point for a new pathway.
It doesn't.
It doesn't, no.
Yeah, and when you're trying to just build a new foundation where your only self-worth has been determined by men who buy you for sex or force you into those situations, you have to create a new identity, and you have to create a new foundation for yourself. Yeah. And you cannot do that the majority of the time if you have criminal charges. These women can't even work in their children's schools because they have these charges that were forced on them. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started to say, I haven't been able to do anything about any of that. That needs to change. Mm-hmm. Like, something needs to shift. So what is it that needs to shift? And I realized it's our laws. Yeah. It's our laws that make it possible for these women to be arrested and to continue to be victimized by the system of prostitution. Yeah. So I started to just explore that. Okay, so what can we do about this? And that's when we were talking about the equality model. These models have been passed in other countries that have worked. Not perfectly, because there is no perfect system. There are always going to be flaws. There are always going to be loopholes that traffickers and pimps will find. I'm not by any means saying that the laws that we now have in place, LD 1435 and LD 1436, are perfect. They're not. Right. But what happened was people from all over our country came together, many, many, many survivor voices, 8 of them from right here in our state of Maine, came forward to support these bills because they knew the gravity of what this could hold if we were able to successfully pass them. And in 2023, we did. We were the first state in our country to pass these bills to provide protections for the people being victimized and go after the real issue, which is the demand. We need to go after the people who are buying sex so that this can stop. Because the money is always going to be an enticement for traffickers and pimps. That's always going to be there. And they're always harder to go after. It's billions of dollars that these people make trafficking women or people. They realize, I can sell a person over and over and over again, but I was selling drugs before and I can only sell a drug once. Yeah. But I can sell this person over and over and over again. And traffickers and pimps are starting to realize that, and they're starting to realize it's more profitable to sell a person. Yeah. But even if
so wild, just like fundamentally though, right, that a person can be bought or sold.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And even if in a worst case scenario, because really quickly, like there were four lanes that I had to choose from, that all of us had to choose from when we were looking at the change we wanted to create. It was either staying in the system we've always been in, which is criminalize everybody, criminalize all of it, That wasn't working. It hasn't worked ever.
Yeah.
To help victims and to go after the real issue, which is the buyers. That wasn't working. The other option that I was presented was the equality model, which is the one that ultimately I landed on and us as the state of Maine landed on to be the best course of action. Not perfect,
Yeah.
but better than where we were, with the caveat that there were 2 other lanes to choose from. And a lot of people are in support of those lanes, which is full legalization or decriminalization.
Yeah.
I will never, ever, ever be in support of legalization or full decriminalization for the simple fact that there's no safe way to sell and buy sex.
Yeah.
There's no way to do it. And there are people who say that they're out there willingly and they're doing this by choice and they want to do it. That's fine. I still don't believe that in any situation it can be safe. Because even those people who have come to me and said, I am a prostitute by choice, I want to be here doing this, even they have told me they've been in situations where it
wasn't safe.
It was not safe, where they were harmed, and they didn't do anything or feel safe doing anything about that, because who's going to believe them?
Yeah.
If they're in a situation where, yes, he paid me, but he did this and I didn't want him to do this.
Yeah.
They just don't disclose it. They just don't go.
Yeah.
And the demand will outweigh the supply at some point.
Yeah.
So more people will be brought in by force against their will or tricked into it and then just be in this system. That's why I will never support a full decriminal legalization model. But by passing the equality model, for some people, it can be a stepping stone to what they truly want, which is full decriminalization or legalization. And that's what we're working so hard in implementation for, to make sure that people understand this as a protective measure for people being victimized.
It's so helpful to hear you describe the 4 lanes, because I wouldn't even name myself as like outside this issue, because this, as you know, you and I have been in touch. Sophia's House Center for years, right? We've been talking about sex trafficking in our communities and the activities of sex for sale. And I know that there is the what would always done model. I've been following everything that got to the laws that you talked about today. But I think the most prominent voices that I often hear are in those last 2 lanes. And more importantly, I think there are assumptions that somehow, because let me put this in the right terms, the person who is being sold, the trafficked individual, right, that their participation in it, even if it was something they were okay with at one point and aren't now, or if they were never okay with it, that was always the act that was criminalized, and it was always that individual, right, that was criminalized. And I think this movement away from that to criminalizing the buyer and to be focusing on the demand side of things, I think a lot of people have conflated that activity with it being decriminalization, because up until a couple of years ago, as we've started to shift the narrative and increase understanding, which I think it's not just like flashy new ways of talking about it, it's new ways of understanding it. I really think there are so many people who are like, man, they don't hold anyone accountable anymore. Everything's legal now. Like, you hear that narrative. You can see it in some of the, the local Facebook groups and such. And I think it's really helpful for people to understand it is not that there is not legal accountability happening, the focus of it. And when you do look, when you see, and they happen from time to time where, the arrests are in the newspaper, the arrests are for the buyers these days, that is the face that is in there. I think that's a really important and powerful shift, but I really do think that there's a lot of folks who conflate lanes 3 and 4 with our current reality in lane 2. And so it's really helpful for you to describe it. So thank you for that.
No, you're welcome. Yeah, we always refer to it as partial decriminalization, because we're not criminalizing the person being victimized anymore, which we were doing before. So it's a partial decriminalization.
But when your entire life narrative is oriented around like that's the person doing the wrong thing, right? Like that's the illegal act that happened, and now that they're not being held accountable, like there's no enforcement. And so it is really helpful to hear you kind of spell it out so clearly, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions around that too. Look, see, we're still busting myths.
Yes,
we'll still get a last one in. I know. I've loved our time, and I have to be thoughtful about yours. We're gonna we're going to finish with our looking back, leading forward.
Looking back, leading forward, where we invite our guests to share advice or insights from their experiences to help lead us forward.
What is one lesson or piece of wisdom that you would share? Just one. You've got a million nuggets. You got to boil it down to what is the one lesson or piece of wisdom you'd share with someone aiming to make an impact? You've done really impactful things. What's the advice that you'd give someone else who comes to you and says, "Hey, I just want to make some change in the world. I just want to have like a meaningful impact"?
I think specific to the work that I do, I'd say that everybody has a role to play. We all have a role to play, even if we never encounter somebody that has been trafficked. You still have a role to play. You have a role in protecting all the people around you just by being informed. Have conversations like this around your dinner table. Like, don't make it awkward. Don't keep it in the dark. Mm-hmm. Bring it to the light so that people can realize, this is something we need to be talking about in every circle, in every space. Because as employers, often you don't know who you're hiring.
Yeah.
You don't know what their history is with trauma. You need to inform yourself of this issue so that if somebody does bring something like this to you, you know what you can do about it. And you look at them with humanness, with a kindness, instead of with a judgment.
Great advice.
Yeah.
Let's all go make a change in the world. Small ones, big ones, first steps, that's fine. That's fine. Just let's all make a change. Thank you so much. We have not gotten special treatment. Tricia is amazing at sharing her story and being open, and I've had the good fortune to witness that on many times. But it never ceases to fill me with gratitude. Thank you for sharing so openly and helping bring it out into the light, because I think the things that we are concerned with most in society are the ones that we tend to keep in the dark the most. And how are we ever going to change that? Right? So what is it they say? Sunlight's the best disinfectant. Like, bring it on out into the, bring it out onto the open. I've had these conversations with my kids at my dinner table to the point where they'll correct language around what you say now. And it does start. It just starts in normalizing it and being able to talk about it. So thank you for all that you do. Thank you for leading in Androscoggin County, across the state, across the nation. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been amazing getting to know the chambers of commerce in our state, and just what you guys do has floored me and opened my eyes to so many more conversations and exposed me to so many more people that we can be talking with. And again, like kind of policy work, meeting with chambers has opened up my eyes to
we do a lot of policy work. I don't know that everyone knows that. So
you guys do so many things I'm just unaware of. So it's amazing.
Thanks.
So
we'll make that the title of it. No, that's right. But we do. It is often not known, and that's why I say again, like, don't be surprised to ask your chamber, who will almost undoubtedly know the local organization they should refer you to, where you might find some tip sheets, how you might get some resources. We do all kinds of fun stuff, and you can still rely on great networking events. That's like the chamber hallmark. We've got you covered on all those accounts.